and, observing that he had taken his pipe from his lips, after a very long whiff to keep it alight, and was evidently about to tell his story without further solicitation, gathered his large coat about him, and shrinking further back, was almost lost in the gloom of the spacious chimney-corner, except when the flame, struggling from under a great faggot, whose weight almost crushed it for the time, shot upward with a strong and sudden glare, and illumining his figure for a moment, seemed afterwards to cast it into deeper obscurity than before. By this flickering light, which made the old room, with its heavy timbers and panelled walls, look as if it were built of polished ebony, the wind roaring and howling without, now rattling the latch and creaking the hinges of the stout oaken door, and now driving at the casement as though it would beat it in, by this light, and under circumstances so auspicious, Solomon Daisy began his tale.
It was Mr. Reuben Haredale, Mr. Geoffrey's elder brother.
Here he came to a dead stop, and made so long a pause that even John Willet grew impatient, and asked why he did not proceed.
"Cobb,"
said Solomon Daisy, dropping his voice and appealing to the post-office keeper.
"What day of the month is this?"
"The 19th.
"Of March?"
said the clerk, bending forward.
"The 19th of March? That's very strange."
In a low voice they all acquiesced, and Solomon went on.
"It was Mr. Reuben Haredale, Mr. Geoffrey's elder brother, that 22 years ago was the owner of the Warren, which, as Joe has said, not that you remember it, Joe, for a boy like you can't do that, but because you have often heard me say so, was then a much larger and better place, and a much more valuable property than it is now. His lady was lately dead, and he was left with one child, the Miss Haredale you have been inquiring about, who was then scarcely a year old."
Although the speaker addressed himself to the man who had shown so much curiosity about this same family, and made a pause here as if expecting some exclamation of surprise or encouragement, the latter made no remark, nor gave any indication that he heard or was interested in what was said. Solomon therefore turned to his old companions, whose noses were brightly illuminated by the deep red glow from the bowls of their pipes, assured by long experience of their attention, and resolved to show his sense of such indecent behaviour.
"Mr. Haredale," said
Solomon, turning his back upon the strange man,
"left his place when his lady died, feeling it lonely like, and went up to London, where he stopped some months, but finding that place as lonely as this, as I suppose and have always heard say, he suddenly came back again with his little girl to the Warren, bringing with him besides that day only 2 women servants, and his steward and a gardener."
Mr. Daisy stopped to take a whiff at his pipe, which was going out, and then proceeded, at first in a snuffling tone, occasioned by keen enjoyment of the tobacco, and strong pulling at the pipe, and afterwards with increasing distinctness.
"Bringing with him 2 women servants and his steward and a gardener. The rest stopped behind up in London and were to follow next day. It happened that night an old gentleman who lived at Chigwell Row, and had long been poorly, deceased, and an order came to me at half after 12 o'clock at night to go and toll the passing bell."
There was a movement in the little group of listeners, sufficiently indicative of the strong repugnance any one of them would have felt to have turned out at such a time upon such an errand. The clerk felt and understood it, and pursued his theme accordingly.
"It was a dreary thing, especially as the gravedigger was laid up in his bed from long working in a damp soil, and sitting down to take his dinner on cold tombstones, and I was consequently under obligation to go alone, for it was too late to hope to get any other companion. However, I wasn't unprepared for it, as the old gentleman had often made it a request that the bell should be tolled as soon as possible after the breath was out of his body, and he had been expected to go for some days. I put as good a face upon it as I could, and muffling myself up, for it was mortal cold, started out with a lighted lantern in one hand and the key of the church in the other.
At this point of the narrative, the dress of the strange man rustled as if he had turned himself to hear more distinctly. Slightly pointing over his shoulder, Solomon elevated his eyebrows, and nodded a silent inquiry to Joe whether this was the case. Joe shaded his eyes with his hand, and peered into the corner, but could make out nothing, and so shook his head.
It was just such a night as this, blowing a hurricane, raining heavily, and very dark. I often think now, darker than I ever saw it before or since, and that may be my fancy, but the houses were all close shut, and the folks indoors, and perhaps there was only one other man who knows how dark it really was. I got into the church, chained the door back so that it should keep ajar, for, to tell the truth, I didn't like to be shut in there alone, and putting my lantern on the stone seat in the little corner where the bell rope is, sat down beside it to trim the candle. I sat down to trim the candle, and when I had done so, I could not persuade myself to get up again and go about my work. I don't know how it was, but I thought of all the ghost stories I had ever heard, even those that I had heard when I was a boy at school and had forgotten long ago, and they didn't come into my mind one after another, but all crowding at once like. I recollected one story there was in the village, how that on a certain night in the year, it might be that very night for anything I knew, all the dead people came out of the ground and sat at the edge of their own graves till morning. This made me think how many people I had known were buried between the church door and the churchyard gate, and what a dreadful thing it would be to have to pass among 'em and know 'em again, so earthy and unlike themselves. I had known all the niches and arches in the church from a child. Still, I couldn't persuade myself that those were their natural shadows which I saw on the pavement, but felt sure there were some ugly figures hiding among them and peeping out. Thinking on in this way, I began to think of the old gentleman who was just dead, and I could have sworn, as I looked up the dark chancel, that I saw him in his usual place, wrapping his shroud about him and shivering as if he felt it cold. All this time I sat listening and hardly dared to breathe. At length I started up and took the bell rope in my hands. At that minute there rang, not that bell, for I had hardly touched the rope, but another. I heard the ringing of another bell, and a deep bell too, plainly. It was only for an instant, and even then the wind carried the sound away, but I heard it. I listened for a long time, but it rang no more. I had heard of corpse candles, and at last I persuaded myself that this must be a corpse bell tolling of itself at midnight for the dead. I tolled me bell, how or how long I don't know, and ran home to bed as fast as I could touch the ground. I was up early next morning, after a restless night, and told the story to my neighbours. Some were serious, and some made light of it. I don't think anybody believed it real, but that morning Mr. Reuben Haredale was found murdered in his bedchamber, and in his hand was a piece of the cord attached to an alarm bell outside the roof, which hung in his room and had been cut asunder, no doubt by the murderer, when he seized it. That was the bell I heard. A bureau was found opened, and a cash-box which Mr. Haredale had brought down that day and was supposed to contain a large sum of money was gone. The steward and gardener were both missing and both suspected for a long time, but they were never found, though hunted far and wide. And far enough they might have looked for poor Mr. Rudge the steward, whose body, scarcely to be recognised by his clothes and the watch and ring he wore, was found months afterwards at the bottom of a piece of water in the grounds, with a deep